The greatest fear of many older adults isn't death, it's something quieter, more daily, more insidious, precisely because it happens slowly, in small doses, almost imperceptibly, until the day it can no longer be ignored. It's looking at your own daily routine and realizing that your mind no longer responds the way it used to. Not all at once, not with a dramatic event that marks a clear date on the calendar, but through an accumulation of small moments that, individually, seem insignificant and together form a pattern that starts to weigh, forgetting where you put your keys, not once but with a frequency that didn't exist 2 or 3 years ago, locking up mid-sentence with the exact word on the tip of your tongue, feeling it's right there, accessible, and still not coming, failing to remember the name of someone familiar, someone you saw last week, someone you've known for years, and having to navigate the entire conversation around that gap. For those who live this, it doesn't feel like a small thing. It feels like important parts of their own identity are silently drifting away, because memory isn't just cognitive function, it's continuity. It's the thread that connects who you were to who you are. It's the archive of the stories you tell, the people you recognize, the decisions you make based on what you've lived. When it starts to fail, it isn't just information that's lost, it's part of the feeling of being yourself. And that's exactly why I decided to stop accepting the narrative that this is simply age catching up. Because the more I investigated, the more I realized that narrative was wrong. For a long time, we were taught to accept that aging meant forgetting, as if the mind had an expiration date, as if after a certain age, decline was not just expected but inevitable, a question of when, not if, an immutable biological law that simply had to be accepted with resignation. But when I began seriously diving into studies on neuroplasticity, I found something that completely contradicts that fatalistic view. The adult brain, even the aging brain, even the brain of a person in their 70s, 80s, 90s remains alive, remains adaptable, remains capable of forming new synaptic connections, reorganizing neural roots, responding to adequate stimulation in ways that previous generations of scientists believed were impossible after childhood. Neuroplasticity is not a privilege of the young. It is a fundamental property of human neural tissue that persists in varying degrees throughout the entire lifespan. And what does that mean in practice? It means that memory, focus, and mental clarity don't depend only on your age. They depend on the conditions you create for your brain to operate. They depend on care, routine, adequate support, the stimulation you offer or fail to offer to the most complex and most responsive system in your body. And that distinction changes everything. Because if decline were purely inevitable, purely genetically programmed, purely a matter of the calendar, there would be nothing to do but wait. But if it depends on conditions, on environment, on habits, then it can be influenced, slowed, in some respects, partially reversed. The quiet truth, the one that rarely comes up in routine medical conversations, is that many memory lapses don't come from nowhere. They have causes, specific, identifiable, and in many cases addressable causes. The first is low-grade chronic inflammation. This state, silent, without obvious symptoms, easily ignored for years, is one of the primary enemies of long-term brain function. The brain is extraordinarily sensitive to systemic inflammation. When the body operates in a state of chronic inflammation, something that can be induced by decades of inadequate nutrition, sedentary living, unmanaged stress, sleep deprivation, the microglia, which are the brain's immune cells, enter a state of permanent alert. And in that state of permanent alert, they end up compromising the very neural connections they were supposed to be protecting. The second cause is reduced cerebral circulation. The brain depends on a constant, abundant supply of oxygenated blood. Any factor that reduces that flow, less flexible arteries, poorly controlled blood pressure, sedentary living that reduces cardiovascular efficiency, directly impacts neural function. Neurons that receive less oxygen and fewer nutrients operate more slowly, communicate less efficiently, and are more vulnerable to progressive damage. The third cause is inadequate sleep, especially deep sleep deprivation. And here we arrive at something that completely changed the way I understand brain health. The brain has a nightly cleaning system while you sleep, especially during the deepest phases. A system called the glymphatic system becomes highly active. It circulates cerebrospinal fluid through brain tissue, collecting metabolic waste accumulated throughout the day, including proteins like amyloid beta that, when not adequately removed, accumulate and interfere with neural function. It's literally a nightly neural cleaning cycle, and the result of that cleaning, when it happens adequately, is waking up with a clearer mind, sharper reasoning, more accessible memory. But when sleep is fragmented, superficial, insufficient in its deep phases, that cleaning doesn't happen completely. The residues accumulate, and night after night, week after week, that accumulation progressively compromises clarity and cognitive function. The fourth cause is deficiency in essential nutrients for neural communication. The brain is a metabolically demanding organ. To function well, it requires a specific set of nutrients: essential fatty acids for the integrity of neural membranes, antioxidants to combat oxidative stress, neurotransmitter precursors, B vitamins for acetylcholine synthesis, minerals like magnesium for the regulation of synaptic activity. When any of these nutrients is lacking, something that happens with increasing frequency as we age, both due to reduced intestinal absorption and progressively less varied diets, the impact on cognitive function is direct and measurable. It was exactly from the understanding of these causes that researchers began identifying simple, accessible ways to create a more favorable internal environment for the brain. What they found is at the first link in the description, and that's when I noticed something that seemed almost too obvious to be true, and that, precisely for that reason, had been ignored for so long. The night can be a forgotten ally of memory. Not despite what happens while we sleep, because of what happens while you sleep. The brain isn't simply resting, it's actively working, organizing information received throughout the day, deciding what to consolidate into long-term memory and what to discard, strengthening important synaptic connections, performing the glymphatic cleaning that removes accumulated waste, regulating hormones that affect mood, energy, and cognitive function the following day. It's the brain's most productive period, and paradoxically, the most ignored when we think about cognitive health. But here's the insight that shifted the perspective for me. If the body receives adequate support before this period, if the right conditions are created before sleep, the nightly processes tend to be more complete, more efficient, more restorative. And this is where something common, familiar, and present in millions of homes around the world comes in. Coffee, not as a miracle, not as an isolated solution, not as a magic formula that solves everything on its own, but as a vehicle, an intelligent, culturally integrated, practically universal vehicle for introducing specific compounds that promote sustained brain energy, cellular protection against oxidative stress, and better cognitive performance when used consistently over time. Coffee is already part of the morning routine of an enormous portion of the world's population. Not because it was prescribed by a doctor, not because it requires special discipline, but because it creates a ritual, a moment of pause, of comfort, of transition between the night's rest and the day that begins. And when that ritual is enriched with the right compounds, it becomes something more than a comfort habit. It becomes a daily cognitive strategy. Several natural compounds have been attracting growing attention from the scientific community for their potential benefits to brain health. The first is cinnamon. Cinnamon bark contains compounds called cinnamaldehyde and cinnamic acid, along with a significant density of antioxidants. Research has investigated the association of these compounds with protection against neuronal oxidative stress and with the modulation of inflammatory processes in the central nervous system. But there's a specific aspect of cinnamon that is particularly relevant for brain health: its influence on glycemic regulation. The brain is the most glucose-dependent organ in the body, but it doesn't function well with glycemic instability, with the sharp spikes and drops in blood sugar that characterize the modern diet. When glucose oscillates violently, the brain experiences periods of excess followed by periods of scarcity, which manifests as mood swings, difficulty concentrating, and that mental fog that seems to appear out of nowhere. Cinnamon compounds have demonstrated, in studies, the ability to modulate the insulin response and contribute to a more stable glycemic curve, and more stable blood sugar means a more constant, reliable energy supply to the brain throughout the day. The second compound is pure cacao, not the industrialized milk chocolate rich in sugar and poor in active compounds. Pure cacao, or chocolate with a very high cacao content, contains flavonoids, especially epicatone and catechin, that have demonstrated in multiple clinical studies several relevant effects for brain health. These flavonoids cross the blood-brain barrier and exert direct effects on the cerebral vasculature, improving blood flow to specific regions of the brain associated with memory and learning, especially the hippocampus. Neuroimaging studies have shown measurable increases in cerebral blood flow following regular consumption of cacao flavonoids. Additionally, cacao contains theobromine, a stimulant gentler than caffeine, with a more prolonged effect and without the anxiety spikes some people experience with pure caffeine. The third compound is turmeric, specifically its active principle curcumin. Curcumin is perhaps the most extensively studied natural compound for its anti-inflammatory and neuroprotective effects. It crosses the blood-brain barrier, something most anti-inflammatory compounds cannot do, and exerts direct effects on brain tissue. Studies have investigated the association of curcumin with the reduction of cerebral inflammatory markers, with protection against the accumulation of proteins associated with cognitive decline, and with the stimulation of BDNF production, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, the protein that acts as fertilizer for neurons, promoting the growth of new connections and the protection of existing ones. The fourth element is magnesium. Magnesium participates in more than 300 biochemical reactions in the body, and a disproportionate number of them involve the nervous system. It regulates the activity of NMDA receptors, which are fundamental structures for synaptic plasticity and memory consolidation. It participates in neurotransmitter production. It plays a crucial role in sleep regulation, especially in facilitating the deep phases where lymphatic cleaning happens. And here is a concerning data point. It is estimated that a significant percentage of the older adult population has inadequate magnesium levels, partly due to reduced intestinal absorption associated with aging, partly due to progressively mineral-depleted diets. When we talk about memory and cognitive health, we're not talking about one isolated ingredient that does everything. We're talking about creating a favorable internal environment, reducing inflammation, improving circulation, stabilizing energy, providing the building blocks the nervous system needs to work better. If you want to start this process today, what science has isolated about these compounds and how to combine them practically is gathered at the first link in the description. As simple as it always should have been, But something important needs to be said honestly. Real results rarely come from a single change. The brain is not a simple system that responds to one isolated variable. It's an ecosystem, and ecosystems respond better when multiple factors align simultaneously than when only one is optimized while the others remain problematic. What does that mean in practice? It means enriching your morning coffee with neuroprotective compounds is a real and valuable step, but it works better when inserted into a broader context of brain care. Restorative sleep is non-negotiable, not just in quantity, 7 to 8 hours for most adults, but in quality, creating the conditions for the deep phases of sleep to happen completely, reducing blue light exposure in the hours before bed, maintaining consistent schedules, avoiding heavy meals in the evening, creating a sleep environment that favors deep sleep. Daily movement is essential. Not grueling exercise, but regular movement of low to moderate intensity that improves cerebral circulation, stimulates BDNF production, and reduces systemic inflammatory markers. 30-minute walks, 3 to 5 times per week, produce measurable changes in cognitive function within just a few weeks. Adequate hydration is frequently neglected. The brain is approximately 75% water. Even mild dehydration to 1 to 2% below the ideal level produces measurable reductions in cognitive performance, processing speed, and working memory capacity. In older adults, the thirst mechanism is often less sensitive, making intentional hydration even more important. Active cognitive stimulation, not passive consumption of entertainment content, but activities that genuinely challenge the brain, is one of the most powerful stimuli for neuroplasticity at any age. Learning something new, reading dense content, having conversations that require reasoning, solving problems, any activity that takes the brain off autopilot and requires it to form new connections. And the management of chronic stress, because chronically elevated cortisol is directly toxic to the hippocampus, the region of the brain most associated with forming new memories. Each of these elements, on its own, already makes a difference. But when they combine, when you consistently create an environment favorable to brain function on multiple fronts, the result is exponentially greater than the sum of its parts. Many people describe something similar when they begin consistently aligning these factors. The mind that used to wake up foggy starts becoming clearer earlier. That morning sluggishness that had become normal, that warm-up period the brain seemed to need before actually functioning, starts shortening. Concentration improves, not dramatically overnight, but progressively. In a way that you start noticing you can maintain focus in conversations longer, that you can finish thoughts without losing the thread, that the task that used to need to be redone 3 times because you forgot what you were doing in the middle starts flowing more naturally. Name memory, which tends to be the first to show signs of failure and the most socially visible, starts responding more reliably. The names that used to take too long to come, or didn't come at all, start showing up when you need them. And with all of this comes something that goes beyond cognition. Confidence. The confidence to speak without fear of locking up, to participate in conversations without the silent anxiety that you'll forget something important at the wrong moment, to make decisions with the sense that your mind is present and functioning reliably, not instant transformation, gradual reconstruction, and that tends to be more powerful because it sustains itself over time, because it's built on real changes in the underlying systems, not on artificial stimulation that lasts while the substance is in the body and then disappears. I like to remind people that preserving memory isn't just about remembering names or dates. It's about maintaining identity. It's about recognizing the people you love, not just knowing that you know them, but recognizing them with that immediate familiarity that requires no effort. It's about continuing to tell the stories of your own life, being the guardian of your own narrative, not depending on others to fill in the blanks. It's about continuing to make decisions with clarity, choosing your own paths based on your own accumulated wisdom, not based on what other people say you decided before. When we understand this, brain health stops being an item on a list of health concerns. It becomes a priority, not luxury, not exaggeration, not premature worry. Priority, and the right path exists. It's documented. It's within reach of any person who decides to start. The complete method is in the pinned comment. And if this content made sense to you, subscribe to the channel. In the upcoming videos, I'll keep showing you what science has to teach about protecting memory, recovering mental clarity, and aging with more strength, autonomy, and presence. The memory that today seems distant may simply be asking for support, consistency, attention, the right nutrients, adequate sleep, necessary movement, the cognitive stimulation that keeps the brain alive and responsive, because in many cases more than people realize, the mind hasn't given up. It's just waiting to be nourished the right way. And when you begin doing that, when you consistently create the conditions the brain needs to function at its best, it responds. Not as a miracle, as biology, as a living system that, when it receives what it needs, does exactly what it was designed to do.